Alright guys, today let's talk about Elon Musk and his grandfather. We've all heard bits and pieces about who his grandfather was, but many people still don't know the details, and Elon Musk's roots actually trace back to Saskatchewan, and they run deep. So his grandfather was Joshua Haldeman, and that was his mother's father, and he was heavily involved in politics throughout most of his life, much like Musk himself is right now. In his life, he clashed with Canadian prime ministers and engaged in heated debates even over Canadian sovereignty. But beyond that, he held extreme conspiratorial views that were shaped during the hardships of the 1930s in Saskatchewan. Now, let's go back nearly a century to the mid-1920s because that's when Joshua Haldeman began farming near Swift Current, Saskatchewan, and it didn't take long for things to go sideways. Now, in 1929, the stock market crashed and it kicked off the Great Depression. At the same time, there was a severe drought that was sweeping across the prairies, and it caused crops to fail and forced thousands of farmers off their farm. And one of these farmers was Haldeman. But instead of simply blaming economic misfortune, he became convinced that there was a global communist conspiracy behind it all. And he believed that there was a secret cabal that controlled the banks and the media, universities, and healthcare. He even thought that they were pushing for the pasteurization of milk and fluoridation of water and mandatory vaccination as part of some sinister plan to weaken and control the population. Determined to fight this perceived conspiracy, Haldeman threw himself into politics. First, he joined a socialist movement that sought to eradicate capitalism. A few years later, he shifted to another radical group called Technocracy Incorporated. Technocracy Incorporated wanted to eliminate political parties and politicians altogether, replacing them with a government run by engineers and scientists. Now, Haldeman was a true believer, and at one point he was even arrested for his involvement. But in 1940, he abandoned the movement after it took what he saw as a dangerous turn. Technocracy started advocating for the US to take over Canada and Greenland by purchase, negotiation, or even force. The goal was to create a powerful new entity called a technate, which would isolate the continent from the rest of the world. Haldeman publicly condemned this idea, calling technocracy a scientific Frankenstein that was conspiring against the British Empire and Canada's sovereignty. After leaving Technocracy Incorporated, Haldeman moved on to a different political movement, the Social Credit Party, and this party championed for lower taxes, fewer regulations, and Christian social values. In a newspaper article, he argued that the problem with politics is that Christianity was left out. He later became the leader of the Saskatchewan Social Credit Party and ran for premier against Tommy Douglas, who's the man that would go on to establish Canadian Medicare. Haldeman also ran in federal elections against two future Canadian prime ministers, William Lyon Mackenzie King and John Diefenbaker. Then, in 1950, he left Canada altogether, taking his family to South Africa. There, he openly supported apartheid, which was the country's brutal system of racial segregation. In an article for the Regina Leader Post, he wrote that South Africa's black population was very primitive and that it must not be taken seriously, adding that it takes 3 natives to do the work of 1 white man, and that black people cannot assume responsibility and will abuse authority. Unfortunately, these weren't just passing opinions, because Haldeman continued spreading his racist ideology throughout books and publications for the rest of his life. He passed away in a plane crash when Elon Musk was just 3 years old, but his legacy of conspiratorial, racist, and anti-democratic beliefs didn't disappear. And given Elon Musk's own admiration for authority figures and embrace of conspiracy theories, it's really worth asking just how much of that worldview he inherited from his grandpa.